All right, Dr. Nick Norwitz, there's been a lot of buzz about red meat potentially causing diabetes. And I know that we really need to dissect that literature to really get a full understanding. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that we can do that, on this episode. Can you give sort of a high level view of what's going on, why people are talking about this, what the big deal is? Is red meat really a concern when it comes to diabetes? What's up?
After today's video, I put a link down below for LMNT electrolytes. They are not sweetened with erythritol. LMNT electrolytes are 1,000 milligrams sodium, 200 milligrams potassium, and 60 milligrams magnesium. But that link down below gets you a free sample variety pack with any purchase of LMNT electrolytes. So whether you purchase their sparkling, whether you purchase their stick packs, or whatever, you get a free sample variety pack, and that's exclusively using my link down below. That is drinklmnt.com/Thomas. Again, drinklmnt.com/Thomas. Really interesting stuff. They curb my appetite entirely, but I also have them in a fasted state, and I sip on them during my fasted workouts because I feel like I actually get replenished, but I also get my cravings satisfied. So that link is down below in the description.
Yeah. So there were two major papers that just came out back to back. It was kind of like a 1-2 punch in the literature. One in Nature Metabolism, which is a top basic science journal, and the other in one of the Lancet journals, another top journal, both talking about a link between red meat intake and diabetes. High level, I don't think that there is real reason for concern, like in terms of everyday life, red meat intake causing diabetes. One thing to just emphasize is the effect sizes were very, very small. So for example, in the Lancet, which was a meta-analysis of 31 cohorts, the hazards ratio was 1.10, which is tiny compared to something like having obesity with a risk ratio of like 4.44. So big picture, point one is the observed associations, not causal relationships. Associations were very small. But there were some other major limitations of these data, or caveats, I should say. So for example, in that Lancet meta-analysis, there was a lot of what we call heterogeneity in the cohorts they looked at. So there were 31 cohorts and some conflicting literature, or conflicting data, where really only 10 of the 31 had any positive relationship observed whatsoever, compounding on the very small effect size, with some even trending towards lower risk. So when you look at what's called a forest plot, it looks kind of messy. The signal isn't very clear. It's just when you kind of smush them all together, you end up with this very tiny effect size. So one aspect is small effect size. The second aspect is conflicting data, heterogeneity in the data. The third is confounding. We know there's a lot of healthy user bias with respect to red meat intake. So people that tend to engage in unhealthy activities, given what presumed healthy diet is, tend to eat less red meat. So people that eat more red meat tend to have more obesity, more diabetes, more smoking, which were variations when you looked at especially the Nature Medicine study. So combine these things, really small effect size, an association that isn't causal or isn't known to be causal, a heterogeneity in the data, and major confounders. When I combine these, practically speaking, I would call it a little bit of a nothing burger. But obviously, you can see how this would get picked up by the media as red meat intake can cause diabetes. We can talk a little bit about the biological plausibility there, because that's one other layer I would add. It's like, I know a lot of people are going to see these headlines and then their BS detector goes off. But like, is there any potential here? And what I would say is my reading of these literature are that they're nothing to get up in arms about now. I think they're relatively weak, but that doesn't exclude a possibility. These are the kind of literature that I think are curious academically for hypothesis testing. But when it comes to treatment and prevention of diabetes, I don't think anybody serious would, contradict the idea that the low-hanging fruit are like weight management and probably sugar and ultra-processed food reduction, not red meat elimination for diabetes.
If we do look at the sort of biological plausibility of this, what is the potential mechanism there that these studies are looking at, or that further studies should be looking at?
Yeah. I mean, the first study in Nature Metabolism was about heme iron intake specifically, which is obviously in red meat. And they were kind of arguing in the discussion for, again, they were just observing a phenomenon, potential iron toxicity, causing things like ferroptosis and just like oxidative stress. So potentially there's something there. Like, I think it's actually interesting, and I have an open mind about the possibility, but I don't think it bears out, fully yet in the literature. And also, one interesting thing about the first paper that I probably should bring up is then they looked at what could be conceived of as like mediating variables. So not only what was the outcome with respect to diabetes, but like other metabolic markers, things like triglyceride to HDL ratio, insulin resistance. And they were finding typically that higher heme intake associated with like higher triglycerides, lower HDL, higher insulin. And so the reason I raise that is because I think it actually provides a filter through which people can decide maybe this is or isn't relevant to me. So like, say you're someone who eats a low carb, high animal based diet and you're eating a lot of heme. Well, if the literature says that there's a link between heme iron intake and diabetes, but that these markers might be involved, if you don't have those markers, which you can measure, then you can kind of deduce it's probably not relevant to you. That's the way I would think about it. I guess a tangential point or something to raise, which I'd love your thoughts on, is how can we keep the conversation focused on the topic at hand? So here we're talking about red meat and diabetes. But as soon as these papers come out, the reason they hit the media so hard is because there's already so much emotional charge on these dual topics. Like, red meat is just a viral topic in and of itself, be it related to, climate or animal welfare or heart disease. And I have a really hard time kind of keeping the conversation focused where I want it and not letting, stereotypes and other emotions with respect to this topic bleed into just an analysis of the claims and data at hand. Does red meat cause diabetes? And I think the answer is we do not have data to support that claim.
It is a very difficult one because there's always going to be emotion no matter what. And that's going to get just exacerbated each time some new study comes out. I think the best concept, the best thing that you can do is get people excited about, as much as this sounds bad, get people excited a little bit more about mechanisms and get them excited about that so that they're willing to go narrow, because people won't really go narrow. They'll go myopic, like with, but they won't go narrow. They won't go deep because it's hard. And because to go deep, you really need like a foundational kind of repository of like literature in your mind already, right? Like you need a baseline.
Yeah.
So yes, you need to educate on that baseline, but as long as the algorithms are sort of working the way that they're working, it's really hard to make sure that someone sees video 1, video 2, video 3, they're going to see video 1, then they're going to see video 7, if that makes sense. Like they're coming in from all different angles. So they're never able to follow a clear path to really go deep, right? You see this when you're creating content and you make one broad scale subject and then you try to go narrow later. You're attracting people that may have never seen the first video. So now they're lost and they're confused and they just throw up their arms and they go back to their beliefs and their emotions, because the emotions are going to be what rise to the top, right? The cream always comes to the top, whatever's going to. So it's really, really difficult. So like I've always found, okay, as much as it sometimes gets you in trouble, if you get people excited about the mechanisms, then they're willing to listen a little bit more. And you do a really good job of sort of crafting it as story a lot of times and giving these metaphors and things like that. So I think that direction is the way to go. Because I don't think that making any bold claims and trying to like combat this giant beast is going to work, right? It's like, as long as you've got people talking about red meat, you're going to have this friction point. It's just period. But if you get the right people excited about mechanisms over time, they're going to learn and say, okay, this is the topic at hand that we're looking at. We're looking at red meat and diabetes via these particular pathways. Let's focus on that. And I think if you keep preaching positivity from that perspective and not sort of discounting the other side, just like you did, I think over time, that's the way to do it, at least my opinion.
Yeah. And there's another layer to that, which is like, you can talk about communicating with the general public and kind of cultivating a positive community, but what about the academics? Because like when this came out, the first thing, it came to my attention because it was trending on Twitter. So I go to that tab and see what people are saying. There's no analysis of it. It's just people abstract bombing with big profiles because it probably fits with their worldviews. Like, here's the largest study, blah, 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 because it has something like 2 million people. That's like a virtue signaling with respect to an end value. That's not an analysis of the data at hand, but it was something that probably fit with their worldview that they know would be big news, so they put it out there, maybe sometimes with a screenshot of a highlighted abstract. And so I don't know how to solve that problem. It's just something I observe that I find a little bit disappointing, especially when like I put out my analysis points publicly. I'm waiting for pushback or some kind of engagement on this topic. And it doesn't feel like there are other people wanting to do that as much in public sphere. I mean, it's hard on Twitter, although you do have a lot of text that you can play with. It doesn't incentivize long form, like thought out analyses of new literature. So there's changing the incentive structure from the public and then like within academics.
It's, for anything to succeed on social media, it has to be polarizing one way or the other. And that's what's really difficult. And when you look at something like this, clearly the headlines are what are getting the attention. Even when you're looking at how it's portrayed, and not even necessarily, even if it's just the abstract or worse, just an explanation or what someone's impression is of this, that's going to be digestible enough. So people are going to see that, and people always want to feel smart too. So like when they watch something like that or read something that's very simple, it makes them feel like they're educated on the topic. And now they either confirm their worldviews or, got them pissed off enough by going against it. But if we stop focusing maybe on the tendency is to want to go and create a title or create a headline that talks about that specifically, because that's going to get the viewership. The problem is that again just triggers that emotion. Coming at it from a different angle where you say, hey, what is the mechanism that is doing this? This is really interesting. And try to create buzz around that, where it's almost operating in parallel to this giant discussion that's happening over here, where you're going narrow over here, but it doesn't even swim in the same pond, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then you're getting people like, oh, he's talking about that study that all these other people are talking about, but you didn't engage that sort of tribalistic behavior that would normally come in play. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, you're a man after my own heart, because I love the mechanisms most. Like that's what I love to break down. And I often find it actually is like the difficulty in communicating some of that literature is then showing the clinical relevance without over extrapolating. But I guess on clinical relevance, what are your thoughts on like full on carnivore diet? That'd be the extreme end of red meat intake.
That's an interesting question, because I personally feel like there is a very strong line. Okay, so I'll take fiber, for example. Carnivore diet, obviously zero fiber works very well for many, many, many people. But it's like the moment that any fiber is introduced, it's like, okay, then you're in this low fiber realm where maybe that's not good. It's like, if you're going to have fiber, go all the way and have more fiber. Or if you're not going to have fiber. So I always view carnivore, I don't have anything bad to say about carnivore at all. I view that it's just a very clear line of delineation between carnivore and what's not carnivore. And it's like, if you're going carnivore, you can't be like being like, well, I'm going to have carnivore and have a couple stalks of asparagus today. I mean, you can, but then you're defeating the purpose of carnivore and you might not respond well. So as far as like people's success with it, sure. I mean, you can't deny people have success with carnivore.
Yeah.
Personally, I never felt really great doing carnivore, but who knows? Maybe there's some bioindividuality that comes into play there. Maybe I didn't give it enough time. I personally feel that any kind of long-term ketogenic diet, whether it's carnivore or just going whatever kind of Mediterranean keto that you and I used to always talk about, I think the benefits are there either way. I think that when it comes down to people with their whatever metabolic issues or potential autoimmune issues, those are the people that tend to thrive. But they're also the people that really need to be put in a box. People that I don't want to have to think about anything else. So all health factors aside, just psychologically, I think carnivore works really, really well for people. And at the end of the day, just like you talked about with the hazard ratio of 4.44, if it gets the weight off of you, I think that should be top of mind. I think that, I don't care how people want to get there, at least initially, get the weight off you, get that BMI down, because that's probably the biggest elephant in the room the enemy's right there for all of us, right? So how are we going to get there?
Yeah. I have something I found very interesting, because I've made the decision, I was going to say mistake, but I don't think it's a mistake, to kind of wade into studying it a little bit. And it's been unlike anything else in terms of, I don't want to get into too much how the sausage is made, but publication barriers and bias. against even studying it as a concept. And I think you and I tend to come at things from a pretty, as far as people go on the spectrum, kind of emotionally devoid curiosity on, like, for me, like, this is an interesting thing. There are all these clinical narratives. There's this biological plausibility for its use case in all these conditions. And I'm just fascinated by the possibility of its therapeutic potential in a wide range of diseases, while simultaneously holding open the possibility things like, heme intake from red meat could cause diabetes. That's a possibility. It's just interesting to me, especially in the wake of these two big publications on red meat, the phobia of even studying it as a topic. Mm-hmm. I mentioned to you before we jumped on that, like, we'll be having, I guess it'll probably be good that there's a lot of red meat talk. We have a publication coming out on carnivore diet and inflammatory bowel disease. And I have to say, like, interviewing those patients, it's a case series of 10 patients, was truly remarkable and humbling from a clinical perspective. Like, their stories of struggle from severe ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, something that touches my heart quite deeply because it's the condition I struggle with, ulcerative colitis. To be in a place where you, like, basically have no quality of life, to then recover that through this intervention. So we did, these were all people with biopsy-proven Crohn's or colitis, and basically are now all off all medications for their IBD in full clinical remission. We quantified that by something called an IBDQ32. And when it comes out, we present there some, patient narratives, patient quotes, all along with the clinical histories. It's just, like, truly remarkable the degree to which this has, well, at least these people believe, and I have no reason to doubt them, has genuinely saved their lives. And you have that, and you combine it with, again, mechanism, really interesting biological plausibility. So we already know that there's an inverse association between ketone levels and IBD activity. That's been observed. There's new literature on how fiber elimination, maybe more specific to carnivore, could change microbiome metabolism, literally have pathobiont microbes like Mucosporidium migrate around in the gut for therapeutic effect. In fact, this is seen clinically in pediatric Crohn's. It's known that fiber reduction via liquid nutrition can put people that are treatment refractory into remission. So it's interesting for me from, like, a cold scientific point of view to say we have people who are being helped here. We have really interesting physiology. Why is there phobia to studying it at a rigorous level when patients could benefit? And my impression is because of these emotions we were talking about. As soon as it's brought up as a topic, carnivore, red meat, one gets typecast and all these other topics kind of start to bleed in, including things like just politics. And it's so hard to then direct the conversation back to being like, I'm not saying carnivore diet's best for humanity or the planet or longevity or heart health, but, like, for IBD, which is the topic at hand, the question at hand, isn't this interesting? Could this help people?
I agree with you, because I think that as someone that gets excited about the mechanisms, and sometimes, online it can get me in trouble, right? Because I'm not a doctor. And I can be a little cavalier sometimes when I get excited about the mechanisms, but I look at it from the same perspective as you do. I get excited about the possibility of certain things. And from my own sort of N of one experience, like, if I see something and I say, wow, that's a possibility for me, cool, I want to try that. Like, that's exciting to me. So I usually want to share that with the world. And I've learned how to kind of say, okay, how do I navigate this appropriately so that I don't upset the wrong people? Because as much as, like, in real life, in associating with people, yes, have conviction, but when you're talking to the world, acknowledge sides, acknowledge things, okay? But it makes it very difficult, because with things like carnivore, there are absolutely use cases where people have had tremendous success, and there's absolutely use cases for a lot of people. And to bring it back sort of to mechanisms, I'm curious, when we're talking about carnivore, what's your take on a carnivore style diet that doesn't have red meat or has lower red meat? Because if we kind of dovetail these topics together a little bit, we're like, okay, red meat potentially causes diabetes because of the, okay, what if we do carnivore with less, again, acknowledging that this is a completely different silo altogether. Like these, Nature and Lancet studies, we're not looking at carnivore diet, absolutely, but it does get me thinking, like, well, okay, minus maybe some of the nutrition that would come from red meat, do you think it's possible to do a low red meat carnivore with long-term success, in your opinion?
Is it possible? I think it's possible.
Certainly possible.
I just don't, again, I would have, if you had asked me several years ago, could people eat meat-only diets, especially muscle meat-only diets, and be fine? I would have thought no. But I just know enough people now that are doing, say, like muscle meat only, so no organs, and they tend to be doing fine. In fact, I've done carnivore for a long stint one time. It was 5 or 6 months, and ended up getting intracellular nutrient testing. And one nutrient I just thought I would be low in was vitamin C, because I'm not getting that much from red meat. I calculated it, and I was well below the RDA. But my intracellular vitamin C levels were fantastic. They were like high normal. And the rules of metabolism shifts dramatically when you put your body in a state like that, when you expose it to that dietary intervention. And so I think there might be counterintuitive findings sometime. And like post hoc, you can always go back and like rationalize, well, my NADPH was probably, replenishing the vitamin C. Maybe it was like some sort of cycle. I don't know. The load on oxidative stress from that particular antioxidant might have been reduced. You can kind of post hoc rationalize it, but it was surprising to me. And those are the things that I find the most cool and provocative when, in science, something completely diverges from your expectation, because it makes you curious. Carnivore, I just think it's something that there are a lot of claims about that are hyperbolic, of course, and same with keto or any diet. And I think that tends to retard the research more than people realize, because it makes it kind of a joke and a meme, and then it actually makes it more difficult to do. Like, I would love to have like a whole food plant-based vegan versus carnivore randomized control trial for inflammatory bowel disease. That would be fascinating. We could do it with multi-omics. So multi-omics is like, you have all the ohms. You have genome, proteome, microbiome, transcriptome. And we're getting technology now where you can kind of combine those not only into pictures of individuals, but if you get it longitudinally, you get like a video of what you are as a specific physiologic organism. And then you can start to figure out like why different people respond to different interventions differently. There was one of my favorite studies of all time. It's called the Molecular Choreography of Acute Exercise, I think. It was in Cell 2020, senior author Snyder. But it was one of these kind of longitudinal multi-omic studies. And figure, I believe it was 6B, was one of the most beautiful synthesis figures I've ever seen. What it was showing was gene expression patterns after exercise, stratifying by insulin-resistant and non-insulin resistant folks. And there was a cluster of genes that literally went in opposite directions in response to the same exercise, depending on if you were insulin resistant or not, which just not different magnitude, different directions. And obviously, the beneficial effects of exercise are exerted mostly through changes in gene expression that change our physiology over time. So what does it say that based on some characteristic baseline factor, in this case insulin resistance, you could have opposite gene expression profiles? I think that's just kind of like a very small example of how unique our physiologies as like individual, I call us meta-organisms, because us and our microbiome can be. So I never rule out the possibility that a specific diet X could be super beneficial for one person, but also harmful for another person. It's just, and by studying these outlier diets like carnivore, I think we have a lot to learn about physiology. So I've always been a fan of studying outliers.
No, that's kind of how, it's funny, I mean, not to go too tangential here, but like I've even looked at the blue zones in that respect, right? So I've always looked at, okay, all record keeping discussion and stuff aside with the blue zones, I was very interested in the fact that rather than looking at the common denominators of these blue zones, why aren't we looking at the outliers? What's unique about each specific region, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's what was interesting to me. I was like, okay, it's easy to look at the common denominators of this and kind of come to some conclusion or potential disconclusion there. But I'm like, okay, well, what's unique about Sardinia? Like, what do they do different? What about Costa Rica? And kind of looking at the outliers. The outliers are always, I think, where some of the low-hanging fruit is. The common denominators are, that's big data. You get a lot of stuff there. But what about what's unique? Because doesn't someone's uniqueness, I mean, we always tell people when they're growing up that, you should kind of lean into what makes you unique, right? Like I always say, like, feed the stallion, starve the pony. Like, I mean, if there's something like a professional athlete that's phenomenal at what they do, they usually have a couple star qualities that make them amazing. Mm-hmm. So why would we want to think all basketball players are tall? Okay, well, what about this particular guy has this unique skill? Why don't we look at that? Why don't we see what makes that happen? Yeah. To me, that's how we, like, rather than be this slow moving beast, it's how we can potentially leapfrog, because we can learn something new. And it's fascinating, but it's also probably hard from a perspective of getting buy-in from a lot of people, or fear that if we talk about this, we're going to look unprofessional because we're leapfrogging and jumping to something that's an outlier.
But we, in medicine and physiology generally, we learn the most from the outliers. Like, Nobel Prizes are won for studying the outliers. Mm-hmm. So, like, one of my areas, well, is I love studying lipids. Like, Brown and Goldstein studied children with homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. That's a 1 in 1 million disease. They got a Nobel Prize for it, because studying those outliers and genetic curiosities, you learn a lot about general physiology that you then can apply to lots of people. And I think people underestimate the extent to which, and this is a point I kind of have harped on as I've started to get into public education. Hasn't really landed that well, but like, they're like, okay, Nick, well, this is a cool mechanism. What's the takeaway? And I'm like, I don't know yet. I don't want to get too hyperbolic and extrapolate to like what you should do in your everyday life. But the fact of the matter is, in science, you just generally, like, if you express curiosity and you chase something, it may manifest in applicable learnings that you could never have imagined. So take the GLP-1 receptor agonist class of drugs. Like, that came out of studying Gila monster development in the 90s. They weren't studying these lizards to be like, and we're going to change the obesity game. They're like, this lizard's venom does something weird to the metabolism of its prey. Let's study that. And here we are that, whether or not you love them or hate them, it's just interesting to see how just pursuing quirky things in science and physiology leads to applicable learnings you never could have imagined.
I think you've sort of answered some of the, like, part of the question that you asked me earlier. Like, how do we get people more interested in sort of the topic at hand? So when we come full circle back to the red meat and diabetes, it's like, okay, like, that's how we do it. We talk about it in sort of the context that you were talking about it. Like, we reverse engineer that. We come back to that and we say, this is really interesting stuff, right? This is so cool. And instead of coming at it, so if we have, let's just generalize here. Let's say you have the low carb space and the, calories in, calories out community. Let's just extremely simplify. There, we know, or shouldn't even say calories in, calories out. Let's just say, whatever's not low carb. What they're going to say. It's predictable, right? You know what each community is going to say when a paper like that comes out. There's also categories and subcategories of people online that sit in these two specific camps, and you just know what their response is going to be when a red meat study comes out, regardless of what it is. If everyone just got excited, and like even the people that were opposed to what the potential sort of implied effect of that study is, came out and were like, this is really cool. I did that with like the recent erythritol study. Like, it was just like, hey guys, like, this is actually cool. We need to look at this more. Mm-hmm. This actually requires, but let's unpack it, right? And I think if everyone sort of took that approach where it's just like, hey, red meat causes diabetes, this is quite interesting, especially coming from someone that would probably people would have a preconceived sort of assumption that you're going to have a particular stance on it. But you come at it with a little bit more ginger gloves and you say, hey, this is interesting. We should look at it. And you're acknowledging, I think you're kind of answering that as you're talking about this, like this curiosity that gets rid of narratives, gets rid of this. And it's a bona fide curiosity that's not one direction or the other.
Spitting back to longevity for a sec, I'm just always interested in people's perspectives on diet and longevity. What's your general perspective on diet and longevity? Let's drop the blue zones.
I think that nutrient quality matters. I mean, I don't have a solid opinion, to be honest, because I just don't think that any of us are around long enough to really know. Mm-hmm. I think the most important thing is probably keeping your body fat lower and your BMI low. I think that's based on what we see out there. That makes the most sense to me. I think regular movement that isn't too stressful Like the kind of life that I live with probably stressing my body too much is probably not necessarily conducive, but maybe it is. I like to think that periodic deficits, not long-term constant deficits, are important.
Mm-hmm.
You look at like Okinawans, it's always interesting to say, okay, well, they're in this X deficit all the time. Not that Okinawans are really like a category to look at anymore, but just for example, I'm like, okay, well, what about the occasional surplus, right? So I do feel like having surplus deficit, and kind of ending up at a net deficit over a 5-year period of time is probably the goal. That's probably about all that I can take. Even the protein discussion gets confusing sometimes. Like, high protein seems to be the way when it comes down to maintaining muscle mass and yada yada and sarcopenia and everything else. But then it also makes me wonder, are you enabling yourself by constantly feeding protein to the point where if you are deprived of it, then are you less efficient with it? So there's all these questions that come up. So I don't have a solid answer. I know that being active, keeping a lower body fat, keeping protein moderately high or moderate, probably the most important things.
Yeah. I would tend to agree. I think it's interesting to see what people conclude from the literature on diet and longevity. I think diets, as long as you got like your basics in order and you're not nutrient deprived or aren't struggling with a metabolic condition or obesity, not going to have that much impact on longevity. It's interesting. I think that the thing that unifies most centenarians is generally just social. So like social community and like life purpose. And beyond that, I can't say there's too much. Although there's a lot of interesting, now spinning back to curiosity, like literature coming out with respect to longevity physiology. Do you see that? It was in Nature Aging, a small extracellular vesicle paper. It was about plasma transfers. It came up on my radar. I did a video about it with speaking about good thumbnails, about Brian Johnson on it. That one's doing stellar. But I had never really dug into this idea of like young blood transfers. It sounded vampiric and a little bit comedic to me. I'm like, can this really work? What's the science behind it? This is this new paper out in Nature Aging 2024 where they actually looked at what the mechanisms might be and found that there are these packages that circulate throughout our blood and also the blood of mice. They're surprisingly conserved in terms of their composition, which includes these non-coding microRNAs. So RNAs that don't get turned into protein, but themselves have modifying functions, including altering mitochondrial metabolism. And so they showed that by transferring these microRNAs, you could basically transfer metabolic youth. With any of these sorts of studies, you need to primarily do them in mice, but it does line up with some of the human literature. And one of the really interesting things was they can classify the microRNAs, and they were conserved with humans to the point that you could use human, young versus old, small extracellular vesicles, and then transfer, quote, metabolic youth to mice using young human plasma, but not old. It's just, again, coming back to like the curiosity of it. MicroRNAs aren't hard to engineer. Could you just engineer those at like high doses and then, rejuvenate mitochondria through these little like injections that people get every month in the future? Maybe. And I bring that up because I think the innovations that we do make in understanding the metabolism and physiology of aging will provide tools that go well beyond any particular diet. Now, the fundamentals need to be in place, like you should eat a good diet, but whether that's carnivore or vegan, I don't think it's going to make that much of a difference in the long run, provided you're not a centenarian already.
Well, Dr. Norwitz, I tend to agree on that. And man, where can everyone find you?
I'm at Nick Norwitz on basically all socials. There's not another Nick Norwitz in the world that I'm aware of. So NickNorwitz. I've historically been most active on Twitter, now trying to get YouTube up and going and on other socials like Instagram.
Right on, man. Thanks, bro.
Thanks.